Okay, so now let's move our classical model into what we might refer to as the neoclassical influence. Ultimately, we sort of tend to refer to the model that sort of comes out of the sort of late industrial revolution, sort of post marginal revolution time period. That sort of maybe like post World War One, pre World War II era of economics. The model that had sort of become vogue at that point, we tend to refer to that as the neoclassical model, but I've always sort of thought about it as classical slash neoclassical. The sort of confusing part is that next week we're going to start talking about the sort of Keynesian revolution, and then ultimately we're going to talk about something that we typically call the neoclassical synthesis, which is actually a Keynesian neoclassical synthesis, even though it sounds like it's just, so it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So if you ever, you're not quite sure what I mean, if I say something like the neoclassical synthesis, I'll try to make sure that I'm sort of clear about that. So now let's think about what, we're going to keep with us, and what is the reason why we're going to, let's say, make some alterations with respect to the model and turn it from a classical model into a neoclassical model. The nice thing is that ultimately we actually make some simplifications, and so ultimately the neoclassical model, I would argue, is in fact a little bit easier to understand than the classical, mainly because you don't really think too much about the labor market in the neoclassical model. Basically, the sort of argument that we make in the neoclassical model is that if we assume labor market's always clear, then at any given point in time, there's going to be a particular real wage. And at that particular real wage, there's going to be an equilibrium level of employment. So therefore, in the sort of neoclassical way to think about it, we think about labor as fixed, in addition to capital being fixed. So we fix both labor and capital. The idea is that, again, if labor is clearing the market, then we can think about it in terms of a stock of labor, just like we can think about it in terms of a stock of capital. And so when we think about sort of where does production come from in the neoclassical model, it's going to come from a production function, and we're going to make it really easy. We're going to fix both capital and labor. And then what that's going to do is that's going to create for us something that we're going to call potential GDP or natural output. And the idea behind potential GDP or natural output is that there's a particular amount of goods and services that your economy can produce given its actual production function. And so if your economy is efficient, it's going to produce Y bar. It's going to produce potential GDP. The only reason why your economy wouldn't produce Y bar is if it was inefficient. Now, the thing about classical economists is that they also tended to believe that the economy was always efficient. That basically the only reason why the economy wouldn't be efficient is if the government intervened. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. And so the classical argument was the economy is going to be at Y bar, that's sort of the basic idea. Now, graphically, this sort of starts us off in a very kind of simple world, and that is thinking about, let's not draw completely in a straight line, thinking about how we're going to model some of this. So let's start moving towards an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model that we're gonna come back to a lot for the remainder of the term. And so let's start with output, or GDP on the horizontal axis, and then we're going to put price level on the vertical axis. Now, we haven't really talked about prices too much. You'll notice that in the classical model, there really isn't prices. The only place that prices show up in the classical model is actually in terms of real wage. The argument in the classical model was that essentially all that matters is real GDP, and that ultimately money simply causes this sort of inflationary phenomenon. It simply creates nominal GDP. Okay. So what we mean by that is that your production function is going to give you a certain amount of potential output. Right there. We're going to call that aggregate supply. and that aggregate supply is at that Y bar. So again, if your economy is efficient, it's going to produce Y bar. And it doesn't matter. There's sort of no responsiveness to this supply curve to price. You'll notice it's completely vertical. We call this a perfectly inelastic supply curve. If you think back to your principles classes. And again, remember, in the classical model, there really isn't a demand. There's just aggregate supply. In the neoclassical model, though, we're going to eventually add aggregate demand. But graphically, this is the way that you want to think about potential GDP, right? Now, I have this model here, which is basically kind of taking the main arguments of the classical model and then sort of turning it into the way that we're ultimately going to think about the neoclassical model. So all of this, right? We have a labor market right here. We have a production function right here. So there's some equilibrium in the labor market that generates an equilibrium level of output, right? Or natural level of output. And then in terms of sort of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework over here, the way that we get there is we just construct a 45-degree line. That just allows us to have the same intercepts, GDP on both intercepts. And then that allows us to have what is sort of a neoclassical view of this process, which is this aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. Now, the sort of neoclassical argument is that aggregate supply is essentially the same way that we've thought about it in terms of the way the classicals did. But we are also, again, going to fix labor at that natural level, that sort of efficient level of labor. And we're basically going to assume that the only reason why your supply is ever going to increase or decrease is because of changes in the production function, right? So if your production function, for example, increases like this, then for that same level of labor, we now produce more. So when we take this over, we now have a shifted out aggregate supply curve. Now, I know this is a little bit messy. I didn't plan on drawing this additional aggregate supply curve, but that would sort of be what the process looked like. So if we simplify it and we just have this, then we can think about improvements in production or potentially dysfunction in production causing these shifts, right? So we can think that is a positive increase in aggregate supply, and that is a negative impact on aggregate supply. Typically, we think about additions to aggregate supply as coming through technological progress. And then the reductions in aggregate supply are usually tied up in what are referred to as in exogenous shocks. So, for example, the 1970s oil crisis. Right, a 1970s oil crisis is one way to think about a sort of negative aggregate supply shift. Right, so oil became much more expensive in the early part of the 1970s. Oil was an important part of most supply chains. Supply decreased, aggregate supply decreased, and then, of course, this is no good. It ends up triggering some inflationary pressure. I'm sorry, it triggers inflationary pressure. It eventually causes a recession. So the idea here is that in the classical and neoclassical sense, the only way to actually grow your economy is through improvements in production. So this is where you sort of get that idea of what we call supply side economics. Now, what's unfortunate about supply side economics is that term has been sort of bastardized. In fact, very often what most people in 2025 mean when they call something supply side policy is actually, ironically enough, a demand side policy. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so let us continue. All right. We're not going to spend much time here on returns to scale. It's something to sort of keep in mind and have in the back of your head. Certain production functions have certain properties. We sort of, in the same way that, again, we have that sort of well-behaved preferences, well-behaved production functions for us are going to be production functions that have constant returns to scale. And we typically will assume that concave production function, right? So our production function looks something like this. So if we have labor here, we have output here, and then we have a production function, which maybe we've fixed capital, K bar, and then labor. And so, that's your production function. So scale just means if I increase capital and labor, how much does my output change? So the extent to which output changes relative to changes in both capital and labor. And so returns to scale is a very simple concept. If 10% increase in both capital and labor causes a 10% increase in output, constant returns to scale. 10% increase in both causes a less than 10% increase in output, decreasing returns to scale, and then increasing returns to scale would be 10% increase in both causes a greater than 10% increase in production functions. Now, we will later on, when we talk about the concept of human capital and the way in which country level production functions take advantage of human capital, we will get to sort of an idea that maybe there's increasing returns to scale with respect to certain production. But I think it's safe for us to generally assume that production functions have constant returns to scale. And the nice thing about constant returns to scale is that it in a sense, sort of makes investment meaningful, but not too meaningful. Because you're going to get more output if you invest more in capital and labor. But if you have constant returns to scale, you're going to get out what you put into it. Whereas if you have increase in returns to scale, you literally get more out of it than you put into it. And that can create some kind of weird incentives if we allow it. So just to sort of keep our models a little bit more understandable, we'll keep that that way. We talked a little bit about this previously in yesterday's last lecture, the sort of idea of, ultimately a firm is going to hire employees up until the point where their marginal product is equal to the real wage. And we also can think about a firm as buying capital up until the point where the marginal product of capital is equal to the real rental rate. And again, that's just this market clearing, right? That's part of this market clearing idea. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that this also allows us to start having conversations about the distributional consequences of economic growth in particular. Because when you experience economic growth, and again, remember in the classical, neoclassical sense, the only way that we experience economic growth is through improvements in our production function that boost out aggregate supply. But when, for example, your production function increases in this direction, oops, let me do labor here and output here, then as we've previously mentioned, the slope of this line is marginal product. So marginal product of labor goes up, right? So when marginal product of labor goes up, the idea is then that the real wage is also going to rise along with it, right? So one of the things that's important is the extent to which marginal product of labor changes relative to an increase in labor over time. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you actually go through the derivations of marginal product of capital and marginal product of labor, so here's marginal product of labor, what you see and find out is that capital is an increasing function of marginal product of labor. So in other words, if you were to take the partial of the marginal product of labor with respect to capital, it's greater than zero. So the greater the capital stock, the greater there will be additions to marginal product of labor. Therefore, the greater there will be increases in terms of wages, right? And then you'll notice that for marginal product of capital, that labor shows up again as a positive function. So there's these sort of interesting interplay between real rental rate of capital, which is always going to equal marginal product of capital in the neoclassical and classical models, and the real wage, which is always going to be equal to the marginal product of labor. And so the upshot of all this is that total output in the economy is divided between the payments to capital and payments to labor. So if we think about like the material wealth of the economic system and ignoring anything like assets and all of that, just think about it in terms of supply and demand. Then what this is saying is that output, right, GDP in your economy is going to equal the payments to capital, the payments to labor, right? And so, therefore, if there are changes in your economic system, the distributional consequences, that is, the extent to which there are gains in labor market, increases in real wages, or gains in capital markets, so increases in real rental rates, right? Because if there's increases in real rental rates, then the suppliers of capital profits are going to rise, right? So when you think about economic growth and then, in a sense, the benefits of that economic growth, the distributional determinants of those benefits are going to come back to these marginal products. And again, this says something about capital intensity versus labor intensity. Now, be careful here because there's some counterintuitiveness, as I just mentioned. You have this sort of somewhat counterintuitive idea that the greater your capital stock, the higher you will tend to see gains from real wages because it's going to also increase your marginal product of labor. Whereas if you look at marginal product of capital, it's a negative function of capital. So your marginal product of capital is actually going to decline relative to your size of your capital stock, whereas marginal product of labor is going to increase relative to the size of your capital stock. So you get some kind of interesting counterintuitiveness there. At least it's counterintuitive to me. Okay. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. There we go. All right. So we talked about this in the lecture yesterday. Whether it's labor or whether it's capital, you're going to buy or hire up to the value that it creates for you, which is just marginal product of labor times the price of your product. Now, that demand side that I was mentioning before. Remember, classical model doesn't really think about demand. It says something about spending in the economy, but in the classical model, spending is simply a function of supply, right? In the neoclassical model, the big sort of addition is this idea of there being aggregate demand, okay? And for our purposes right now, again, we're going to deal with a closed economy, and so our aggregate demand is just going to be consumption plus investment, and then we're going to add government spending. So one big consequence, so to speak, of the neoclassical edition is we start including government spending in our GDP calculation. That is not something that the classicals did. If you actually go back to previous lectures, you might remember that we talk about spending in the economy as being Y is equal to C plus I, consumption plus investment. Actually, what we said is consumption plus savings, but then we know that investment's going to equal savings, so consumption plus investment. So you get that classical idea of Y equaling C plus I, and then we're just going to add on to it this idea of government spending. Now, what's important about this idea of government spending is that it also allows us to, in the macro sense, add in something like taxes. Whereas previously in the classical model, there really wasn't any place to put taxes, and all we had was sort of this, like, for example, the Ricardian equivalence idea, which was more of a sort of thought experiment into the nature of taxes. I mean, government spending as a sort of idea was certainly around, but it wasn't really something that economists felt comfortable including into what we considered an economy's wealth. In part, perhaps because historically government spending wasn't that much, right? The things that government did wasn't perhaps as economically meaningful as it is certainly today, or even was at the turn of the 20th century. So in some sense, this is an addition to the classical model, which reflects the growing size of many central governments, even in the sort of capitalist revolution that we happen to see. Now, the big idea here that we're going to bring back from our consumer theory idea is this idea of marginal propensity to consume. So you'll recall that when we got to the end of the dynamic savings model, the two-period dynamic savings model, that there was this idea that consumption's response to increases in income were going to be a function of preferences that or what we call propensity. And so that basically when someone receives $1 in the form of wage, they are going to spend some percentage of it and then save some percentage of it. Well, one of the things that we're doing here, because we're including government spending, is that we're thinking about consumption in terms of after-tax spending. So you'll notice here we have Y minus T. So another sort of addition to the neoclassical model is that we can now put tax payments into the model, which is nice because then we can run sort of interesting experiments with like balanced budgets and so on and so forth. You're actually going to be doing this in the first problem set. So if we have let's see here. So if we have a consumption function like this, C equals 500 minus 0.8, Y minus T, then marginal propensity to consume is just going to be this particular coefficient. That coefficient is going to come from essentially people's appetite for spending. Now, what's going to be interesting a little bit later on is our sort of consideration of changing marginal propensity to consume. And what does changing marginal propensity to consume mean ultimately for these models and especially policy? So we can have a sort of a very typical looking consumption function. Slope of the consumption function is MPC. Nothing sort of new here. Now, on the sort of other two parts of the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure concept here, we also have investment, and then we have government spending. Typically with investment, we will write it like this. So we'll say that investment is a function of interest rates. And so that is obviously a big part of bringing in that sort of key neoclassical idea of savings equals investment, because we know that interest rates, the real interest rate, is the equilibrating force there. And so we're going to assume in our neoclassical model that investment is a function of interest rates, specifically the real interest rate. And then government spending is government spending. We all know what government spending is. The interesting about government spending is sort of why it exists, and I'm actually going to get to that, and because it's an important sort of part of the conversation in the last lecture of today. Okay, so this is a very simple sort of neoclassical model. So we have aggregate demand here, we have consumption here, investment, government spending. Let me erase this. You know what? Let's just not even worry about that. Because I don't need to write down consumption at the end there. So let's just I don't know why it's so hard to erase in Adobe. You would figure they would make it a little bit easier, but whatever. So this is aggregate demand right here. Whoa, I mean, what is going on? Sorry about this, guys. I know it's annoying when we don't just get straight to the point. So aggregate demand, right? And then aggregate supply, and then equilibrium, boom, right? So the idea here is that on the supply side, there is a potential level of output, and then on the demand side, there is essentially a potential level of expenditure. Now, when we get into the Keynesian cross stuff next week, we'll actually talk about scenarios in which planned expenditure, what we plan to expend, is different from what we actually spend. And that has some interesting sort of economic consequences. For right now, there's sort of no difference here. But what is interesting here, and I think I want to point this out, is that if you go back to this concept here, in particular, this concept right here, right, that factor payments, real wages, real rental rates equal marginal product of labor and marginal product of capital, is that ultimately, and that idea that all of the payments to labor and capital equal the amount of income in your economy. So that's exactly what this is. So this says that the output, which is what comes from our production function, that is going to equal the spending in our economy. And that ultimately what we are spending on is in service to the production side, right? So the idea here is that consumption is important because consumption gives rise, in a sense, to the transactions that take advantage of the supply that's already there. So it isn't that consumption causes supply to go up, which is something that we're actually going to think about later on, but rather that consumption merely chews up the supply that is already there. And so we are consuming what we make, right? We are investing in what we make. The government is spending on things that we make. Remember, this is a closed economy. There's no trade in this model. So everything that your economy makes is also equal to everything your economy spent money on. Because what did it spend money on? It spent money on making things. Even if we're thinking about this from the consumption side, right? I consume a good, I pay money for it. What am I doing? I'm paying for its production. So that idea is incredibly important to the neoclassical and classical models. Supply equals demand, but more importantly, supply creates demand. And while the neoclassicals, I think, were starting to question the idea of Say's law, it was a mathematical simplicity, and I think also an economic simplicity, and that's the reason why it stuck around in the models. Okay, I had previously mentioned to you the concept of the loanable funds market, but the thing to sort of know about the loanable funds market is, for our purposes, is that you're going to have a stock of savings. So these are loans in a sense. So we have the supply of loans, and then we have the demand for loans. Now, this supply of loans, S bar is total savings in the economy, and that's going to be equal to small s. Small s is private savings, right here, private savings, which is just output minus taxes minus consumption, and then plus big S. Big S is public savings, which is just the difference between taxes and government spending. Now, typically, we will invoke a balanced budget. And so if we invoke a balanced budget, then we just get rid of that S. And therefore, the amount of available loans in our economy is simply equal to the amount of private savings. Now, if the government runs a surplus, then this S actually exists, and the stock of savings is going to be therefore bigger. If the government runs a deficit, then it's going to decrease from the total level of savings. And again, remember, the equilibrating idea here is real interest rates, right? And so we can see, right, if the government runs a deficit, the classical, neoclassical idea is that running a deficit reduces total savings, right? Because a deficit is going to cause public savings to be negative, right? So big S goes down, S bar goes down, and what we can see is that the supply of loans shifts in, and we get higher interest rates as a result. So this is where you get the idea that deficits cause higher interest rates. That's a concern that we're running into right now in the U.S. economy. There's a concern over government debt, and we're seeing that fear over government debt translate into higher bond yields. Higher bond yields are certainly tied up in interest rates. So, simple idea. Total savings in the economy equals the supply of loans. Total savings in the economy comes from private savings. That's output minus taxes minus consumption. And then public savings comes from taxes minus government spending. And then ultimately, these two things are going to equilibrate at an equilibrium interest rate. Here's the graphical representation I just showed you. There's a decrease in savings, putting upward pressure on interest rates. An increase, for example, in the demand for loans does not correspond to an increase in loans. It simply corresponds to an increase in interest rates. Why is that? Because we're holding S fixed, right? S is fixed. And so, we could potentially, and maybe even it makes sense for us to think about an upward sloping supply of loans curve. But again, we're making our lives very simple here. All right. So this is just some additional things. I find sometimes in economics that students it's hard for them sometimes to wrap their head around something that doesn't feel like a good or a service, and to think about it in terms of supply and demand. And in the context of loanable funds, it's complicated by the fact that we're not really talking about prices, but you have to start thinking about interest rates as the price of a loan. And the important thing to understand about interest rates is that we'll learn later on that interest rates carry with them a lot of information. First off, interest rates carry with them, every interest rate has this sort of foundational risk-free rate. So there's sort of, what would this loan be if there was zero risk, right? What would the interest rate be? Because the bank's still got to make money, even if there's zero risk. Then, of course, the lending institution is going to want to make some money. So there's going to that interest rate is going to be a little bit higher so that there's some profitability. And then, of course, over the long run, the financial institution is going to be concerned about risk. And so that's going to put upward pressure ultimately on interest rates. And so, therefore, we expect the quantity of loans demanded to decline in the same way that if the price of a good increased, we expect the quantity demanded for that good to decline. So you can sort of, again, point a very basic supply and demand idea to the loanable funds market, with the big idea being the equilibration of the interest rate. Okay, and then this is just a very simple numerical example for you to work through. So I would, in a sense, don't look at this. Try to do it on your own and see if you were able to come up with the correct answer. And so the idea here is that we first want to compute consumption. The reason why we first want to compute consumption is because we need to know what private savings is going to be. And so in order to compute consumption, we just take the production side. So this is aggregate supply. So the economy is producing 5,000 units of stuff. And we take that, we also take the level of taxes, and we plug that into the consumption function that we see here. And we do the math there, and we get 3,300, assuming the math here is correct. Now that we have private consumption, this gives us the ability to compute private savings. So we just take output minus taxes minus that consumption. And we see that private savings is $700. We already know here, because government spending and taxes are equal to each other. And so public savings is equal to 0. And then all we got to do is we just take total savings, that's $700, and we set that equal to the investment function. And we set it equal to the investment function, and then we solve for the equilibrium interest rate. So it is effectively ends up being one equation and one unknown at the end of the day. So a very simple sort of process. Work through a couple of these. I'll post some examples to Brightspace. There's a question on your problem set that has you go through one of these. So I would practice it a little bit. I'll have the solutions and everything. That way you can make sure that you're getting everything right. But this ultimately is the neoclassical model. It may seem at this point, well, that's it. A lot of buildup for this. It seems like maybe not worth it. Well, we're going to complicate things certainly in the future, continue complicating it. But I want you to understand that there's actually a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with this particular model. So first off, in this model, we can do fiscal policy experiments, right? Because fiscal policy is change in government spending or change in taxes. So we can actually see what happens if the government cuts taxes, what happens if the government increases spending, what happens if the government's running a deficit and then decides to balance the budget, And then again, the idea of all this is that these policies are going to affect the interest rate, because at the end of the day, the interest rate is going to be that equilibrating factor. And so changes to aggregate demand, whether they come through via consumption, investment, or government spending, is not going to appreciably impact the macroeconomy, because ultimately, right? Let's say the government decides to cut taxes. The government decides to cut taxes, aggregate demand is going to shift up. No change in output, but we do get some nice inflationary pressure, right? So we can do these interesting policy experiments, and we can see, okay, what happens to the macroeconomy if, for example, the government decides to boost output via government spending. All right. Now, the important thing is that not only does a boost in government spending lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which then all else equal puts upward pressure on prices, it's also going to put upward pressure on interest rates. Because if the government increases spending, all else equal, this will reduce public savings. The reduction in public savings is going to cause interest rates to go up. And so, just as sort of a final kind of point here to kind of give you an idea of what the neoclassical model sort of ultimately says about something like policy, is that the neoclassical model predicts that if you cut taxes, okay, no change in output, so output is completely flat, you get higher inflation and you get higher real interest rates. Now, very soon we're going to say, is this true? Is it actually true that a decrease in taxes will cause these things? What conditions would make it true? And then perhaps what conditions would not make it true? That's what we're going to do.